Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on the time zone that you are in. Welcome to this webinar on OT-based Asset Center 6.3. And just to avoid some potential confusion, 6.3 is what actually we in sales and marketing refer to the release. Technically, you will see it mentioned as 6.03. in the file names, etc. But that is just more for historical reasons. And also because this man that you see there, Andreas Timm, who is the chief developer on OT-based Asset Center, decided that it would be a super good idea to always use the 0 before the sub-release number. So this is not just a minor patch, this is much more, as we will see today in this webinar, where I go through the major features that we have added. And before we go into the details, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping issues. There is a Q&A that you can use to just submit any technical questions that you might have, and Andreas will answer them while I go through the various features, and we might also do a joint live Q&A after we have finished the presentation. Another thing, so you have seen Andreas now, it's a real live person. This is not AI. Asset Center is not developed by AI. I also want to give you an idea about other people in the team. So there is Tarif Pouncy. Tarif, please activate your video. You may have heard the name already. Tarif does technical support, and he usually takes care of your tickets that you enter. Tarif is in Virginia, and then we have Wes Davis. Wes is a technical account manager, and he's in Florida. And he takes care of customization. So, for example, writing Python scripts to add your metadata. Okay, with that having said, the other thing that is very important before we go into the subject, we will have a user conference in Miami in February, on February 17th next year. And in that is the day after the ESC4 conference. You will receive invitations for this conference within the next couple of days. And then we ask you to register. The registration and participation is free of charge. The conference will be in the same hotel as the S4 conference. So with that out of the way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the various new features in 6.3. In the meantime, most of you will have received the download links for the files already, and maybe even those who are super eager will have installed the damn thing already. Anyhow, so let's go to the release notes, which I'm going to talk you through. One of the major updates is in the location directory that you see here, where you now have a full tree grid. And that means that there are a couple of more data exposed for all those locations, such as the number of devices. You can see the location IDs, and you can see right here again if this is a reference location or not. And certainly the important point is that now you can also filter and sort. So for example, if I'm interested in finding a location that is called, or location ID that's called ANK, then this list shrinks. And well, you don't see ANK here, that's for a simple reason. I have to expand it, and then I see this sublocation right here. Another example would be I want to filter for a specific location group, let's just say PPE, and the same applies here. After I've filtered, I can expand that list, and there are my two PPE sublocations. You will find that pretty useful, I think, especially for those of you who are using several thousand locations. That was the major reason why we have done this rework because when you are in the thousands of locations, the old location directory was no longer usable. One other thing I would like to point out, if you're used to the old location directory, you might ask, well, where are all the details that I used to see in the right pane that's gone, in order to just provide some additional real estate for all those additional columns here. You will see those details, and you are able to edit those details if you select a location and then click on edit up here, and then you see all the details that you used to see, and they are now just moved into the screen. There you can do your edits, click on save or cancel, and then you see that list again. The next thing, or the next area that we will be looking at, is the access rights. The access rights in Asset Center are now much more tight than they used to be. So let me give you an idea. You know already that it's all about the user groups. This is where you define the access rights. And let's just assume you have defined a group that you have called FlatRock Contractor, where you have a couple of contractors in, and those contractors shall only be able to see something within that site, within the FlatRock site, okay? Then this is your setup that you would want to use. So in the scope, you limit the scope to FlatRock, to the location, and you only give read permission to this partial inventory access, but you set the global inventory access to none. So that is how you configured the access already earlier, before. But here is an important difference. In earlier versions of Asset Center, the users with that restricted permission could not see any devices outside of FlatRock, but they could still see some metadata. So they could still see additional locations, etc. And now let me show you what that means. If I log in as a different user, that is the member of this restricted access group, then if I go back to my inventory and to the locations, you see that all this user sees now in the location directory, that is only in the FlatRock site. He or she doesn't see anything else, and not any other location. And the same thing would apply to the other areas, for example, the systems area, where now only the systems in FlatRock are visible to that user, but not any other OT system. Good, so let's re-log in. The next area with dramatic improvements is the vulnerability management workflow. And those familiar with Asset Center will see that right away. So we have added a couple of new metrics to the CVE list. And maybe the most striking that pops up in your eyes is this middle one here, this chart, where we expose the ratio of fixed versus vulnerable devices for a particular CVE. So like in this example, we see that for this CVE, we are talking about 216 devices that are affected. From those affected, 24 are already mitigated, and the rest is still vulnerable. And you see that ratio expressed here in this chart. In other words, if you're interested in all the stuff that is still pretty much unmitigated, what you could do is just sort by this by this particular metric, and then you would see all the CVEs that are not yet fixed. Another new parameter is the number of fixed versus vulnerable number of devices right here. But by the way, if you are only interested in CVEs where you still have some vulnerable devices. So you could say, well, you know, I don't want to see those in the list right here because everything is fixed already. We have 0 vulnerable devices. Then what you can do is simply add greater 0. And this filter will make sure that you only see CVEs where there are still vulnerable devices, at least one. Okay. Then we have another new metric, which is the V-score that you see here. Okay, and the V-score is you have seen that, or you might remember that from the software list that we also have here in the vulnerability management workflow. The V-score is just the cumulated CVSS base scores for all those unmitigated devices. And that metric tells you, well, this is probably a vulnerability that you would be interested in mitigating rather soon, because due to the higher CVSS base score, it would give you more risk reduction. So it is the CVSS base score multiplied with the number of vulnerable devices, in other words. And you see this might drop rather quickly. So a couple of rows down, we are below 1,000, and then it drops. Okay, so this just gives you another angle for deciding how you want to approach your vulnerability management and which mitigative activities will give you the most bang for the buck. Another thing that's new here is that you can export this list that you see to Excel. So it works just like with the other exports that you may have seen with the other lists. What you see here is what you get in Excel, including all the filters. Okay, so if I now click on Excel export, the list that I'm looking at will be exported to Excel, and then it looks like this. Good. Next thing that we have added is tag management. So you can now assign tags to CVEs as another way to help you in your vulnerability management. So, for example, I have already tagged some vulnerabilities as Google Chrome, so meaning they have something to do with Google Chrome. And if I now click on filter, my list is reduced, and I only see tags with that, CVEs with that specific tag. Okay, if I want to get back to the original list, I click again on that tag in the upper section, and then again click on filter. Next thing, in the chart, we have added another chart here, a subchart, and this is the cumulated V-score. You remember the V-score from just a couple of minutes ago. This is all the CVSS base scores added. And now for that scope that you have defined up here, so this is presently for everything in respect to medium, high, and critical classified vulnerabilities, and you could limit that to a specific location if you wanted to, but let's just keep it as it is. By the way, this graph here only starts a week ago, because this is when we had then technically added that feature, so there is no historical record because the feature didn't exist 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago. Now, what does this mean here? We think that this is a particularly useful addition to the metrics that you can use for your vulnerability management if you compare it to this upper chart here. So this is what you know already. This is just the number of vulnerabilities, like the number of vulnerable devices. But this doesn't reflect the severity of the vulnerabilities. Now, you can argue all day that the CVSS base core does have its problems, especially for OT, and I would certainly agree to that. But then on the other hand, we think that it still provides some additional value as compared to only look at the number of vulnerabilities. Okay, so therefore we added this. So because the difference is going to be when, let's just say, when you have mitigated a specific vulnerability in 100 devices, 100 affected devices, then you will certainly get more risk reduction if that vulnerability has a high CVSS base core as compared to it would be a base score of 4.5, right? So low severity. And this is what you are going to see reflected in this chart right here. And we will elaborate that with a couple of videos on how to actually use that specific chart. The next enhancement, or let's just say the next change that I want to address is, if you are using the REST API, you know that you can also, that you will see the vulnerabilities that affect specific devices when you do the REST export. And the vulnerabilities that we used to list there were vulnerabilities that affected the device in principle. So the device was vulnerable in principle for that vulnerability. And we have changed that in 6.3 in a way that you will only see unmitigated vulnerabilities, which we believe will give you much better guidance for your vulnerability management efforts if you use custom scripts or other platforms that you export to. So from now on, you will only see actual unmitigated vulnerabilities in those REST data. Okay, let's get back to the list. The other thing that we have added for the vulnerability profiles, so when I open a profile for any of these, then we have added that chart that shows you the ratio between mitigated and unmitigated for every single site. And we have also added a counter for the total number of affected devices. And that would tell you right away, well, in Flatrock, well, we have mitigated a couple of devices already, but nothing in Durham. Okay, and now if you open those lists, then you will see that by default, we only show you those devices that are still vulnerable for the CVE. But you can change that view by clicking on Show Fixed Devices. Okay, and then you're going to see all those mitigated devices at the bottom of this table by default. Certainly you can just resort by clicking on that column header. If you're not interested in the fixed devices, you just deselect that box. Finally, in the events, if we go to the CVEs, then you also see these additional parameters such as number of vulnerable versus number of fixed that might be of interest for you when deciding what to do about all these new vulnerabilities that have dropped in over the last 7 days. Okay, that's it for all those new functions for vulnerability management. The next area that we will focus on is the reservation of IP addresses. And for that, we go to the networks inventory. Here we have added the capability that a user can reserve an IP address or more IP addresses, for example, for some plant extensions or for any new project. So to make sure that nobody else will just grab the IP address for illegitimate purposes. Let me show you how that works. So I'm picking any of the networks in this list here. And now if I click on edit, this is what you have seen already. So you can edit the metadata for this network, such as attach some files, also assign a network group, any of those that you have defined earlier. But now there is a new tab that's called reserved addresses. And here you already see a sample entry. Here you can input a single IP address or a range of IP addresses. The user field is filled in automatically. You don't have to set that. But then you can also add a comment. So like for what that reservation is for. And when you have done that, and you could do multiple of these entries here if you want to reserve multiple areas in your IP address space. Once that you have done that, the network profile will inform any user about this reservation. This is what you see here. So the reserved IP addresses will be exposed here in this initial section here. They are taken off the list of the various free IP addresses, and you will also see the reservation in the IP address list, like so here. So they are highlighted in turquoise. You see the comment that was added, and you also see a red R, also meaning this is a reserved address. This is particularly important if at some point in time there is an active endpoint installed for that reserved address. So then the color code is changed to the color code of the device type, as you will remember it already. But in order to highlight this, this is still a reserved address. Therefore, we use this red R. Okay, next new area enhancement in the maintenance section. There is a new, let me rephrase. This used to be the CVE tab, and we have relabeled that to metadata because now there is a little bit more other than CVE updates. So this hasn't changed in respect to the CVEs, but we have added this new area down here, which is the product data update. And product data means things like catalog data from the vendors, so that you would see, okay, that 1756-something, that is an Ethernet communications adapter, for example. Or that you would see, well, the latest firmware for that 1756-something is firmware version 34.12, as an example. And the same for obsolescence data, that a specific product was or that a specific product is has reached end of life, or even the day when it will reach end of life. All of this metadata is now imported automatically online, so that you don't have to manually import the metadata files, as you may remember it from the last version of Asset Center. Now, how is this accomplished? Every week, OT-based Asset Center will try to connect to our server, product updates from Langner, which is metadata.otbase.com. And then the update is accomplished automatically. And you will be able to take advantage of all that updated product information, such as the product lifecycle information. One thing that is very important is this second checkbox down here, upload product catalog to Langner. What does that mean? You will only receive good coverage for all the devices and products in your installed base if you tell us what you have installed. And that means the information that you see when you go to the device inventory and products. Okay, so if you go to that list, these first columns here, this is what is going to be exported when you check that box. And I tell you why this is super important if you want to enjoy full metadata for your products. We cannot grab and gather all the product metadata for all the hundreds of thousands of products that are out there. So we need something like a seed. We need to know what you have installed in order to then pull the information from Cisco, from Siemens, from Rockwell. This is why we need that list of yours, okay? And if you check that box, that list is uploaded automatically without any additional data such as IP addresses or locations, etc. We are not interested in that. We don't need that. So it's just the product names, versions, and the number of installed devices. Why is the number of installed devices of interest to us? Well, there is a simple reason for that. If we would see, for example, that our customers are using thousands of products from a specific vendor, let me just pull one out of the sleeve, like Beckhoff as an example, then we would try to also gather data for those Beckhoff devices, which presently we don't, because we are not aware of customers who would use those products in significant size, okay? And these numbers help us to evaluate if our customers might benefit from additional coverage. So this is why we also ask you to send that information, that we can identify areas for improvement as far as product metadata updates are concerned. So the only thing you need to do is check that box, click on save, and then you're done. And then everything goes automatically. The only thing that you need to keep in mind is you will need to tell your firewall that a connection from the Asset Central host to metadata.otbase.com is allowed, outbound. It's outbound only. And the data that you will receive is encoded as in earlier versions in JSON. So if you want to, you can even take a look at that in plain text. You don't have to, but just to give you an idea of what's going on behind the scenes. A next improvement in the inventory, let's go back there. There are a couple of improvements for the search function. And one of them is that you can now also search for data in custom fields. That wasn't possible in earlier versions. So when you're searching for a device with a specific SAP equipment ID that you have added as a custom field, you can now do that. You can search for devices that are hosted on a particular virtualization host, and you could add multiple of those. And then if you click on search, you will see those specific virtual machines that are hosted on that given host. The other thing is for all those variables where you can use, let me just here in the scope section, for all those scope variables where we have tree structures, you can now quickly select and deselect all the children of a particular entry. So for example, if I wanted to check all those locations in the United States, what I now can do is just do a right click on USA to open the context menu and then click on select all children. Okay, and then you can do your search there. And same goes for deselect. Note that the top entry USA isn't selected also because that is not a child of itself. It is an entity in its own right. So there might be devices that are not assigned to any of those sites, but they're just assigned to USA. And if you want to include those, you would then also check the box up there. And you could do the same thing for device groups and for processes. Next thing in the inventory, in the networks list, you'll now also get the location ID. So if you want to filter for a specific location ID. That's now fairly easy. And then finally, we have some additional information in the maintenance area. As an example, as you see here, you see now a log of all the patches that you have installed. Every now and then we issue patches that could be bug fixes, that could be some minor enhancements of functionality. And in previous versions, both you and us, we didn't know what you had installed, and that sometimes caused problems. So therefore, we are now logging the patches that you have installed. Please note that this list will be reset when you install a new version, but that's by purpose because patches are only active for a given version. So once that you install a new version of Asset Center, that list is empty, and for a good reason, because none of these patches apply anymore. They're pretty much they're consumed by the new release. And then the other new area that you will see in maintenance is system information, which is just a couple of indicators that give you an idea about the server health, like the memory usage and particularly the disk space that is available for OT-based Asset Center. And the reason for that is that you can get an idea, well, will I run into problems when I import those additional 5,000 devices, for example? So you can see right away the free disk space without having to go to the system level, so you don't have to log on as an administrator and figure those values out on the command line. And that is pretty much it for the user interface. Then there are lots of extensions in the REST API that I don't intend to go through here in detail because only a small set of users is presently, and this is our understanding, is using the REST API. So for those of you who are using the REST API, let me tell you lots of new stuff. I just want to point out two things here. The first is, you remember what I told you about tightened access control that you generally see in the user interface. And this also applies to the REST API. So the output that you get from your REST GET query is much more restricted as compared to previous versions. And the other thing that I want to highlight is that that you now can also delete devices, which was not possible earlier because we said, well, then accidentally they delete all their stuff and then they come to us crying for help and there's nothing that we can do. Therefore, we prevented that possibility, but we have added it now because we understand that especially those customers who are using the REST API, they are also using a staging server where they test their Python scripts or whatever they might use, and before they execute the scripts or whatever they are using on the production server. So, and then the other thing is, which I hope everybody is aware of, it is since about a year or a year and a half, it has become so simple to quickly pull a backup interactively from Asset Center. And then if you find yourself in deep trouble because you have messed up your database, you just restore that backup that you have created, let's just say an hour earlier. And all this can be done from the web browser and can be accomplished in a couple of minutes. So that is what I wanted to share with you to give you a better understanding of all those new features. As I said in the beginning, you already should have your download links. Maybe some of you have already the whole stuff running, who knows. And if you run into trouble, as always, just open a ticket or send us an email, give us a call. And we will do our best to help you get Asset Center 6.3 running very quickly.